Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to get the event started. To introduce myself, my name is David Chan. I am the president of the Berkeley College Republicans, and it is a pleasure to welcome our speakers and our audience here today to our Atrocities of the CCP speaker event. I wanted to start off by thanking our courageous speakers for coming all the way around from different states, from the different areas, to share their testimonies regarding their heartbreaking experiences and suffering under the Chinese Communist Party. With us today, we have Mr. Bob Fu, Ms. Li Aijie, Mr. Fan, Mr. Fang Zheng, Ms. Gang Ho, Mr. James Gorrie, and Ms. Minghui Wang. It's incredibly important, not just for us to fight for freedom of speech, religion, and expression, but essential to the survivorship of our society that we give voice to the suffering, expose the prevalent evils in our world, and let these stories be heard. To all of the leftists and CCP sympathizers on this campus who relentlessly tore down our flyers, defaced our posters, and protested, I want you to know that you failed today to stop this event, and you will always continually fail in your effort to silence voices and the prevention of free speech. And to our friends, thank you so much who are joining us via live stream and also here in person. Let's give our brave speakers a warm welcome and kick off this event with Mr. James Gorrie, who will dive right into the topic of communism and the torture that the Chinese people experienced. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Well, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here tonight on this Good Friday evening. This event couldn't be more relevant than it is right now. But before I begin, I'd first like to thank David Chan and the Berkeley College Republicans for putting on this event, very important event, here at UC Berkeley in the eye of the storm, as it were, of whatever Berkeley has become. My thanks also go out to the Epoch Times, for which I'm a contributor at their China desk, for not only promoting this event, but live streaming it as well. The Epoch Times is an island of moral clarity in a sea of confusion, it would appear. As David mentioned, my name is James Gorrie. I wrote a book called The China Crisis about 12 years ago. And in addition to the Epoch Times, you can find my articles, interviews, books, and so forth at my blog, thebananarepublican.com. So this evening, you're going to hear from these extraordinarily brave people who have personally seen and suffered persecution at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, also known as the CCP. Now, my brief talk will address one simple question. Why is it that the Marxist political systems of the world, and tonight we're talking about the CCP, so consistently end up torturing, imprisoning, and murdering millions, if not tens of millions, of their own people? The answer may surprise you. It's simple, but it's not one you may have heard of. First, to get there, we'll take a brief look at the toll that communism has brought humanity. And then we'll take a look at who Karl Marx really was and what he was really all about, what he believed. And why, therefore, at its root, Marxism is not all about materialism and atheism and things like that. That's part of it, but rather, we'll see how Marx's deep religious beliefs, that may be a surprise to some, are the key to understanding communism and its mission in the world. And finally, we'll see that big reason why the CCP continues to commit the atrocities and purges it does against its own people on an industrial scale. So even a brief tour of communism's death toll is quite dreary. 3 million in the Russian Revolution, maybe 100 million with the first 100 years of communism between 1917 and 2017. Stalin's purges, the mass starvation of Ukrainians in the 30s, which, by the way, was the first, quote, genocide by starvation, unquote, in all of human history, brought to you by the Communist Party. Of course, there are many millions more who perished in the Soviet gulags. And then China, which followed Soviet Russia's example, Mao Zedong's long march to communism led to the deaths of up to 30 million Chinese, or perhaps more. The accounting is just not possible. Many more died in prison camps, the comparative gulags in China, and in particular from 1958 to 1962, Mao's so-called Great Leap Forward led to the deaths of tens of millions more Chinese who were, again, starved to death. So there's all kinds of calculations, conservative and not so conservative, but it's been estimated that by a recent CCP official, former CCP official rather, that up to 80 million people died under Mao. And by comparison, even small countries such as Cambodia in the mid-1970s suffered greatly as well. Pol Pot's regime killed about 2 million people, 1/4 of the population in just 4 years. So there really is no shortage of information. Marxist regimes are actually killing machines. They kill societies. But the CCP outperforms them all. The Chinese Communist Party has killed more human beings than any other single nation or regime on earth in the history of the world. But again, why? What is it that makes some human beings capable of such horrific crimes? And how do the CCP members themselves justify their actions? Is it all about materialism, atheism, or both? Sure, they're both certainly part of CCP doctrine, but as we know, materialism, which basically is the idea of everything in the world and the universe being made up of only matter and chemicals and so forth, that would include human beings. We know that's a big premise. That leaves us with no spirit, no soul, no God, no creator, and certainly nothing that would exist beyond this life. So obviously it's no surprise that materialism leads to atheism, and atheism supports materialism. They kind of lead you to the same place. And of course, both of these in the CCP are validated by science, which in turn is used to support the worldview of the CCP and the Chinese Communist Party, rather. And the CCP likes to call it scientific socialism, and they publish books about that kind of thing. But all that still doesn't really explain why the CCP kills so many of its own people. If atheism or materialism were the answer, then Sweden, which is one of the most atheist nations on earth, would have a similar kill rate to China or other communist states. But of course, it doesn't. Certainly, many who call themselves Marxists today, from the CCP members to the founders of Black Lives Matter to legions of university professors, they all believe that materialism and atheism are not only central to Marxism, but are what best describe our reality. But what they don't know or don't acknowledge is the full story about Karl Marx himself. Because although that's part of his doctrine, neither are the real true part of Karl Marx's internal identity, nor how he regarded himself, his own humanity, or his true mission in life as he saw it. The truth is, Karl Marx was not an atheist. Very far from it. Nor was he a strict materialist. He actually worshipped a god, and a very well-known one at that. But Marx knew that all human beings have a deep need to believe in something greater than themselves. He knew that. And of course, the legacy and persistence of world religions across recorded history point to that very obvious fact. So too, as C.S. Lewis would put it, does our sense of morality, right and wrong, and other foundations of civilization. So here in the West, for the past 2,000 years, it's been Christianity and the Bible that has fulfilled that basic human need. But Marx, who was intimately familiar with both the Old and New Testaments, had his goal as to the elimination of both biblical premises and the societies founded upon it. In fact, he wanted to find his point in life to replace them both with a different religion, an anti-religion, an anti-God religion, if you will, but still a religion nonetheless. But Marx knew to do that, he would have to create a suitable replacement. And communism was and remains that new religion, and the Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, and all the other writings were his so-called Bible. So that's where it was. And the thing is, he wasn't even very original with it. He simply stole, or to use the politically correct term, appropriated the Judeo-Christian template in the Bible and inserted his own terminology into that template. French philosopher Raymond Aron pointed this out in his brilliant book on Marxism called The Opium of the Intellectuals, where even a brief comparison makes Marx's grand theft quite obvious. In the Bible, for instance, the Jews are God's chosen people. Marx simply replaces them with the proletariat as the chosen people. In the Old Testament, God sends Moses to deliver the law and lead his people into the promised land. And Marx makes himself Moses, delivers the law via his manifesto, and promises a workers' paradise. Furthermore, God and his divine providence are replaced by history with a capital H and Hegel's dialectical materialism. And along the way, the church is replaced by the Communist Party. You get the idea. It's all very Judeo-Christian in his structure and eschatology, and for one very good reason. In his early years, Karl Marx was a confirmed Christian. Born in Trier, Prussia in 1818, his given name was Moses Mordecai Levy, son of a Jewish rabbi who, a few years after Marx was born, converted to Christianity. Now, the reasons vary why he may have done that, from economic or social needs to even religious ones, but it had a profound impact on young Karl Marx. But what does that interesting bit of biography have to do with the Communist Party and the CCP? Quite a bit, actually. Marx, as you may know, was brilliant on many levels. An accomplished lawyer, he's a tremendous writer, insightful political economist, an unparalleled sociologist, and much more. But he was also a poet. He was a poet for his entire life. And this is where this brief discussion takes just a slightly deeper metaphysical and spiritual turn, because that's exactly what happened to Marx himself as a young man. It is in his poetry where we find the internal man of Marx, the true person that he became, and the ideas that he committed to. Marx expressed his thoughts and intentions in his poetry with an undeniable depth of passion, and cataloging his spiritual struggles with who else but God. Ultimately, as the following quotes will indicate, Marx did not deny the existence of God, but he did express his rebellion against him. And in his poem, The Pale Maiden, Marx wrote, for example, quote, Thus heaven I forfeited, I know it full well. My soul, once true to God, is chosen for hell, unquote. Hardly the words of an atheist. The clarity of Marx's poetic expression shows us the truth and the extent of that rebellion. He not only rejected God like Dostoevsky's Ivan Karamazov, but in that rejection he embraced God's adversary, whom Marx explicitly names in his poem, The Fiddler. Quote, With Satan, I have struck my deal. He chalks the signs, beats time for me. I play the death march, fast and free, unquote. So really, there's no mistaking. It's very biblical. All the main players are there. God, the devil, the whole thing. Marx was no atheist. He actually had an actual spiritual life, if you will call it that, and his own rituals and so forth. He simply changed his alliance from God to God's adversary. Now, this may be hard to accept for Marxists today, particularly for the more sophisticated intellectual class. But for Marx, his allegiance to Satan and to the destruction of Western Christian society, in fact, all human societies, was at the core of his being. Again, those aren't my words. Those are his, as he writes in his poem, Human Pride. Quote, Like unto a god I dare, through that ruined realm in triumph roam. Every word is deed and fire, and my bosom like the Maker's own. Unquote. Again, these poetic confessions, and he wrote quite a lot of them throughout his life, contradict the entire cause, premise, and stated objectives of his Communist Manifesto, i.e., they contradict the promise of a workers' paradise, of equity, equality, and all those things. In other words, Marx's goal for global communism wasn't to reform society, wasn't to edify it, but to destroy it in its bring complete destruction to it. Again, Marx's words, quote, "I long to take vengeance on the one who rules from above," unquote. So what do these deep and quite dark spiritual beliefs mean for class struggle, the proletariat, and all the other pretensions that he wrote about? Firstly, they're a means to an end. They're actually a trope, a seduction to deceive mankind by appealing to our intellect, or more precisely, to our intellectual pride. Secondly, communism and its religious template tries to fill the human need to be a part of something bigger than oneself that transcends time and promises a bright future. Very religious. And they do so to a degree, but in a clever but very inhumane way. And Marx brings out and affirms the very worst in humanity by reducing human beings to units of production and other materialistic and economic terms, all the while packaging it in attractive materialistic pretensions such as scientific socialism and intellectual atheism, but all for the enthusiastic consumption by self-regarding intelligentsia and romantic revolutionaries. And they've been swallowing that vile confection for more than a century. Which brings us to today's Chinese Communist Party. Just this past February at the Winter Olympic Games in Beijing, the CCP made a big deal of promoting its latest book, The Principles of Scientific Atheism, ostensibly because, well, the party must have felt the need to do so. A few questions come to mind. Why does the CCP feel the need to promote a new book on atheism? Has some new fact come to light? Does God not exist even more now? Or perhaps it's to persuade the people, particularly CCP members, that their only hope remains with the party. Or it could be to reinforce the idea of zero accountability for the atrocities that they're committing even to this day. And consequently, why is the CCP purging itself, again, while promoting community prosperity? It seems quite contradictory. Well, according to former U.S. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, quote, "All communist regimes rely on purges, the terrorizing, jailing, and killing of large numbers of people in order to maintain doctrinal purity." Now, unquote. The reality is that's a euphemism. It's a way to place blame for the party's great failures and its ongoing destruction of society on the newly dead and those who are about to be. And so society continues to crumble, just as Marx intended with the Communist Manifesto. How do we know this about China? For more than a decade, China's internal security budget has surpassed its entire defense budget. So what exactly is the CCP afraid of? The party fears the people. What's more, it fears the people's belief in something other than the party: God, Christianity, Falun Gong, Buddhism, any spiritual belief that elevates mankind, that elevates the individual, reveals the party for the monstrous fraud that it truly is, and thereby threatens its very existence. Communism is designed and intended to fail. It's intended to bring about destruction wherever it is instituted. Ironically, the same force that China is pushing against right now it's also desperately trying to copy. Like Marx and Mao, Xi Jinping is persecuting Christians even as he tries to appropriate it. Why else would he replace the Ten Commandments with the 10 G quotes? Why else would he replace Jesus Christ's image with his own? Like Marx, Xi is rather desperate to take vengeance upon, quote, the one who rules from above, unquote. Sadly, today as the CCP continues its atrocities against its own people, it is well down the path of Marx's desired goal for destruction of human society, and tragically, millions upon millions of souls are enduring great suffering because of it. Some of them are with us tonight. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Geng, who will now speak, be the first to speak in quite personal terms of the dimensions of her own experiences at the hands of the CCP.
晚上好，感谢主办单位举办的这个揭露中共暴政的这个活动，也非常感谢朋友的鼓励，让我有机会站在这里，在这个著名的学府 UC Berkeley 这个地方与大家交流，也非常感恩在座的朋友们抽出宝贵的时间在这里听我们家的故事。其实呢，家庭主妇的我呢，对所有的活动我都很紧张。因为近20年了，我有太多的焦虑呀、恐慌呀、不安围绕着我，让我对一切呢心有余悸。我先生高志胜呢，他曾经被美国律师协会授予了国际律师维权奖。美国律师协会呢也发行了他的书《永不放弃的信念及高志胜的10年酷刑和中国未来的信心。他也曾经3次获得3次获得诺贝尔和平奖提名。应该也是在就是说现在活着的人当中呢，也是提名最多的。就是这样子的一个人呢，但是被中共定性为了是头号政治犯。我先生原本是一名普通的律师，一名虔诚的基督徒。他用他自己的职业为受迫害的人代理案子，比如像群体那个信仰案子，像法轮功呀、基督徒呀，还有群体的那种拆迁呀、上访人代理案子的时候呢，屡屡遭到北京市律师协会及司法局的警告和阻止。由于他坚守革除自己的这种职业道德和良心，依然不放弃为受迫害的人代理案子。事实上呢，我的先生呢，他并没有违反中共的法律，他是见证了中共在21世纪法外监禁100万法轮功学员，酷刑、迫害致死，甚至活体摘除器官，是中共违反了他自己的刑法、刑事诉讼法和及宪法。我先生是出于他的一种人类的这种善心正义，他把这种犯罪呢以公开信的形式呢就写给这个国家领导人，招致了2005年北京市律师那个协会跟那个司法局关闭了他的北京市甚至律师事务所，即吊销了他的律师执照，并在2006年的8月份拘捕他，以煽动颠覆国家安全罪判他3年缓刑5年。在缓刑期间呢，又把他软禁，又酷刑他。在5年缓刑刚一结束，直接又把他投入到最残酷的新疆沙雅监狱，3年关小号。在2014年的8月，他从监狱再次释放回家，把他软禁在陕北偏僻的小山村。但在2017年的7月13号，没有任何的通知，没有任何的说明，又非法绑架了他，到现在已经整绑架了他，没有任何的手续，到今天呢已经1706天了，生死不知。一个 GPD 世界第2个国家，一个自称是要称雄世界的国家，然后又是第2次举办了奥运会的国家，就这样公然的绑架了一个无辜的公民1706天。中共呢，他不仅监禁、软禁、酷刑我的先生，我和孩子的生活呢，也一直不断的中共的这种骚扰，甚至一段时间呢，警察就住在了我们家。 2008年呢，警察呢就是不允许我2个未成年的孩子上学，用这种方式来给我先生施压，迫使他屈服。没有办法呢，我在2009年呢就携带一双未成年的儿女，为了孩子的求学，踏上了求学之路，也是一种逃难之路吧。我们经过越南、缅甸，九死一生的偷渡到了泰国，然后辗转到了美国。至今已经13年了。这13年来，我没有见过我的先生，孩子没有见过爸爸。我没有电话，没有视频，我们不知道在哪里，我们甚至不知道他是死是活。你们相信吗？在美国避难的我的丈夫，在中国不是监狱就是酷刑，就是软禁，一家人分离在地球的两端。尽管科技网络如此发达的今天，今年55岁的我们家仅有一张儿子2岁时的全家福。我相信在座的各位，每个人手里都有智能手机，每个人都有无数心爱的人的照片。不管你们身在哪里，在家里，在办公室里，在旅途中，不管你们在世界任何的一个地方，你们随时可以翻看你们父母、孩子、亲人的照片及视频。而这种温馨的场景不属于我的家庭，对我们来说是一种奢望，已经13年。很抱歉，每天清晨起来，我都期待着奇迹能发生。我会习惯性的翻看我的手机，看看有没有我先生新的消息。每当寻找他这个消息的时候呢，我会被一种无尽的说不清的情绪淹没自己，就像肺气炸了，身体有许多那种气泡窜着往上涌，直到肩上。其实呢，我就一直就调整着自己，让自己的呼吸慢一些，再慢一些，数着他失踪的日子：1703天、1704天、1705天。今天4月15号是他被强制失踪1706天。思念和揪心的煎熬吞噬着我的生命，这也是我一天的开始。和我同样被煎熬的还有我先生的家人，他的姐姐，因无法忍受中共公安长期的骚扰和压迫，担心弟弟的安危于2005，担心弟弟的安危忧郁沉寂，在2020年5月，在2020年5月跳河自尽，在生命的尽头也没有看到牵挂的弟弟。和我同样煎熬的还有我的家人们。中共当局呢，他限制我的家人寻找我的先生，没收了所有的人身份证。像在病中，尤其是我的姐夫在身患病重的时候，取药的时候呢，他们都刁难，不给返还身份证，因此呢，造成了救治困难。2016年的5月，我病重的姐夫跳楼自杀。中共直接从我的家族里面夺去了2条人的性命，给我这个破碎的家庭又是重重的一击。尽管我来到了美国，有了人身的安全和自由，但孩子心理上却蒙受着挥之不去的阴影。在缺失父爱成长的孩子，没有人能替代父亲引领他们成长， 成长过程中的重要时刻，比如像在学校，无论是小学、初中、高中，没有父亲分享他们的喜悦，毕业典礼上，孩子们感受到的就是父亲的空缺，孩子们的焦虑让我忧心无比。现在儿子又到了他人生重要的转折点，再次的感恩，我在这里著名的伯克利大学与你们这些天之骄子、社会的佼佼者交流，期待着你们的引领能使我的孩子避免少走一些弯路。高知胜的苦难，我们家庭的苦难，目前还没有到头。在中国，像我们这样子的家庭的迫害还很多。我希望大家关注高知胜，关注中国的人权命运。谢谢大家。
It's a great honor and a privilege to share my testimony with, students and professors, teachers at this great university. And I feel it's also my responsibility to speak for Mr. Gao Zhisheng. It was 2006. I read some writings on a website posted by American Chinese pastors on an online forum. At that time, that was the unique and the comparatively free forum for sensitive topics, including culture, history, religion, and even politics. Some posts about attorney, lawyer, law issues, and Christianity in China aroused my interest by chance. Just like one of my child dream was to be a lawyer or attorney, but I gave up because I found no justice in China. Of which, one of the threads enlightened me profoundly. It was about attorney Gao Zhisheng and his assistance for those people in disadvantaged situation. His thoughts and the faith of Christ began to nourish my emotion for love and a ration for justice. And furthermore, to answer my long-existing puzzles about humanity. And this enlightenment inspired me to explore the Christianity circle on the website. I was intrigued by what Attorney Gao had been doing for years. Mr. Gao Zhisheng, as a Christian and attorney, came to prominence through his advocacy of Falun Gong practitioners and individuals oppressed for their religion or land seizures. His defense of Falun Gong, who had been forcefully harvested their physical organs, reminded me of the sudden disappearance of some very good people that I knew back in 1999 at my university. They are my professors, they are my classmates. Because they were allegedly called evil cult, Falun Gong practitioners, and never came back again. At that time, I didn't know why. I came to find out the truth about Falun Gong practitioners via the VPN software FreeGate. In particular, I read the 9 commentaries on the Communist Party, which is a final verdict on the China Communist Party and its crimes against humanity. Instantly, I understood attorney Gao Zhisheng. This ideation has greatly influenced on my teaching as a teacher. I realized it was almost impossible to protect the righteousness through legal system, and I insisted deliver the truth and the justice to my students. I introduced to my students about Gao Zhisheng and what I knew about Falun Gong, as I thought my students had the privilege to know the truth, just like me. I criticized the brutal torture on the loving and religious people imposed by the Communist Party and its government. I encouraged my students to explore the different opinions in the English-speaking world through reading real books, exploring the real internet, asking questions, and even questioning their teachers, for I knew they needed to explore and experience the conflicts themselves, like me, myself. Loving people like Mr. Gao Zhisheng has helped thousands of disadvantaged minorities, and most importantly, inspired many who are looking for justice and freedom, like me. This probably is apparently the major reason that China Communist Party and its government has been trying so hard to detain and torture him in such a brutal manner. More than 10 years, Mr. Gao has been tormented, abducted, and imprisoned with most of his teeth miserably shed. I know he has been in the bitterness beyond any imagination. Prominent Christian attorney Gao Zhisheng has been kidnapped again by China's government for more than 4 years again, with no due process of law. I urge that prisoners of conscience like Gao Zhisheng be freed this instant before merciful trials of those persecutors being carried out sooner or later. Those in power can shatter Mr. Gao's family, defile his name, kill his body. Yet no one on this earth can possibly deprive of his faith in love, justice, and his everlasting inspirations to his beloved people in China. Thank you.
大家好，非常荣幸能在世界著名的大学分享我家庭的故事。感谢主办方给我们这个机会和平台，感谢在座各位听我的故事。说起我的家庭故事，我的内心是悲愤的。我的先生张海涛，一个在中国普普通通的小生意人，仅仅因为在网上发表69条微信、205条推文，拍摄新疆乌鲁木齐街头13张照片，发到境外博讯网站上，以及接受一些外媒采访等，就被中国政府以煽动颠覆国家政权罪和为境外刺探、非法提供情报罪判处有期徒刑19年。他的这些言论抨击了中国的独裁政权，批评了中国共产党及政府当局。最重要的是，他触碰到了中国政府的敏感地带新疆。他长期生活在新疆，亲眼目睹了发生在新疆的人权危机，揭露中国政府在当地施行的民族压迫政策。他为维吾尔等受迫害民族的人权发声。他长期为权力运动和中国的独立候选做义工，参与废除国务院关于劳动教养问题的决定的签名活动。因纪念6·4和举牌声援良心犯 而遭拘禁讯问，无数次协助访民，把他们遭遇中国政府的不公发布到网上等等。基于以上长期的言行，引起中国当局强烈的不满和仇视，加上他被抓捕后举不认罪，中国当局以重判一个说真话的普通人，以达到威吓新疆人乃至整个中国人的目的。他在看守所被戴沉重脚镣，用手铐反吊着打，连续20天日夜不让睡觉，不准闭眼，如困了就用打火机的火在他的头前后左右点着烧，长时间不给饭吃，经常不让吃饱等。二审开庭前夕，律师给他捎去二审法官的话，说如果你认罪就可减去1半的刑期。他断然拒绝。张海涛平静地说，共产党的话你能信吗？二审刘律师说，凭他20多年的职业生涯及阅人无数的经验判断，此君必定是一个有信仰的人。便问其有无信仰，其告是一个基督徒，信仰上帝。张海涛目前被关押在距离乌里木齐约1100公里的塔克拉玛干沙漠腹地的沙雅监狱，迄今只被允许3次家属会见。2018年4月26日，最后一次得以会见，还源于傅西秋牧师带领我和儿子到美国华府寻求国际救助，海涛姐姐才有机会见到她的弟弟。海涛姐姐说，我问弟弟几个人一个监室，他说就他一个人。问他能出来活动吗？他说原来有一个门，后来门被封了。这再次证实我前2次探视他时他所遭受的酷刑与虐待。他被单独关押，不让放风。因为我把监狱的黑暗曝光出来，为我的丈夫维权发声，我遭到了我的哥哥姐姐们的暴打。他们逼迫我离开我的先生，禁止我在网上发表言论。他们把我打得鼻青脸肿，浑身淤青。我的一个哥哥掐住我的脖子，让我几乎窒息。我挣扎着喊，上帝阿爸父神救我！哥哥才终于罢手。当天派出所的警车不断光顾哥哥的家，他们以哥哥们的工作为要挟。我深知平时爱我的哥哥姐姐如果不这样做，就无法向政府交差。仅差11天，就整整4年了，1449天。中国当局一直不允许家属会见张海涛。我们在去年1月收到过他一封信，1年3个多月，音讯全无。无数次的思念和担忧化作一个个噩梦。张海涛被酷刑，那鲜血淋漓的场景令我从梦中哭醒。多少次夜深人静，孩子睡着，忍不住失声痛哭。最近家人和狱方联系，说因为疫情不允许家属会见。我们要求和张海涛有一个通话，得到的答复是张海涛本人不愿意给家人写信和通电话。我的心在滴血的痛。张海涛，你现在到底怎么样了？我们的儿子穆田，名字是自由的意思，小名小曼德拉，寓意争取人权的意思，都是他爸爸起的名字。这个孩子已经6岁了，从出生到现在从未见过他的爸爸。他画了一个爸爸抱着他的图画，但是多么渴望得到爸爸的拥抱啊！可是成一个简单的愿望，就变成了一个奢望。张海涛是无罪的，他应该得到自由和释放，而不是等到他63岁白发苍苍刑满出狱。不敢想象，也无法想象。长夜漫漫，天总会亮，随时会亮。这是张海涛心中的一句话，也是他的期盼。 如果每个人对这种践踏人权的行径保持沉默，我们每个人都将陷入着黑夜绝望之中，被黑暗所吞噬。让我们一起对这种践踏人权的行径说不吧！感谢上帝的恩典，感谢所有帮助我们，把我们从黑暗泥潭中拔出，放在自由光明之地的组织和个人。如果没有你们，我也没有机会站在这里。我也再次恳请各位关注张海涛，关注中国的人权状况，帮助这对父子能够在有生之年相聚拥抱，让我们一家人早日团聚，也让更多像我们这样的家庭早日团聚。再次感谢大家。
大家好，我叫方正。今天在这里很荣幸和我2位尊敬的女士，耿和女士和李爱杰女士，我们都是很熟悉的。刚刚听了他们的故事，我真的非常感慨。确实，大家都知道中共有很多的暴行，但是我们需要更多的人像这2位勇敢的女士一样，把他们的家人所遭受中共暴行的这些真相告诉大家，希望大家能够更多了解中共的罪行。今天是一个好，谢谢。
So I'll be translating for Mr. Fang Zheng. Hello, my name is Fang Zheng. It's an honor to be here with 2 of the people who I respect the most, Ms. Li Aijie and Ms. Geng He. I'm very touched, and I find it very inspiring to be listening to their story today. And we need more people like them who bravely step up and tell people about the evils that are happening in China.
今天真的是个很特别的日子，4月15号，大家可能知道，33年前，1989年的4月15号，从这一天开始，在中国，在北京开始了一个举世瞩目的全中国的一个民主运动。那么在那个时候，我作为北京的一个大学生，参与了从4月15号开始到6月4号这个镇压的在中国的这个民主运动。我当时是北京的一个大学生。
Today is April 15th. It is a very special day to me. Just 33 years ago, I was a university student at Beijing, and during April 15, 1989 to June 4th, 1989, the student democracy movement had just kick-started, and I was at Beijing at the time.
大家都知道6.4的惨案，1989年6月4号那一天，中共用他的机枪和坦克残酷地镇压了这场民主爱国运动。
As we probably all know, on June 4th, 1989, the CCP had launched a brutal campaign against the students who were fighting for democracy. The CCP had used its machine guns and tanks to swipe against the innocent students.
人们都非常的记住那个著名的坦克人的照片。这个照片，一个勇敢的人士去阻拦了这一列坦克，象征着在那一天人们反抗暴政的一个决心。
We probably are familiar with this photo of the tank man. He is a symbol of people standing up against the oppression of the CCP.
但是其实我希望更多的人知道，是在坦克下失去生命的那些真相。因为在那一天，在中国，在北京，在天安门，在长安街，有很多的人死于中共的子弹和坦克下。我的双腿就是在长安街，就是被坦克碾压逝去。
I want more people to know about the truth of people who die under those tanks. In Beijing, in the Chang'an Street, so many students die. My legs I lost my legs there on Chang'an Street from the tank running them over.
所以 33年过去了，那场残酷镇压的真相，人们其实并不是知道太多，因为我们知道中共一贯以来就是在他的这种暴行之后，就是用谎言去掩盖事实，去掩盖真相。
It's been 33 years, but people know so little about the Tiananmen massacre. And that is because the CCP has habitually erased history with lies after violence.
就我个人的一个经历，就是其实在我被坦克从身后追杀之后，中共的当局竟然无耻地要求我这个受害者一个亲自的经历者，让我去说我不是坦克被压的，让我说成是其他的车祸，以此想来掩盖中共坦克压人的这个事实。
Do you know how ridiculous it is that the CCP actually asked me, after I've been hunted down by the tank and hurt severely from it, they asked me to sign a contract saying that my legs weren't hurt by the tanks.
但是我认为，坚持真相、坚持事实是一个做人的最起码的一个要求。但是在中国，一个坚持真相的人是要付出代价的。所以我在中国，直至2009年流亡美国之前的20年，也是付出了很多的代价，2次被中共抓捕。我热爱的残疾人体育事业也是因为此被中共给取消各种比赛。
And I think it's very important to speak up, to have the integrity and speak up for the truth. But in China, that would mean you're risking everything. You're risking your lives. And I was twice arrested by the Chinese Communist Party for my speaking up, and I was actively engaged in the Paralympics at the time, and that was forcibly put to an end by the Chinese Communist Party.
中共之所以这样做，其实他知道他的罪行是特别担心别人知道，他们是最害怕真相的一个政权。
CCP does this because it is afraid of the truth. This regime is so afraid of people knowing the truth.
所以我在这就特别的对国内的像高志胜律师、像张海涛先生这种勇于在中共的政权下勇于揭露中共政权、维持真相的这些人士，我对他们真正表示特别崇高的一种敬意。所以他们因此也付出了个人惨重的代价。
Hereby, I want to pass my most sincere gratitude and deepest respect for people like Mr. Gao Zhisheng and Mr. Zhang Haitao, who are in China, but they fiercely spoke up for the truth and paid a very heavy price for it.
所以在这里，我希望大家更多的去追寻真相。我们要问责这个残暴的政权，我们希望中共能够及早的被我们去推翻，结束中共的暴政，这是我们大家需要共同努力的事情。只有这样，才不会有这么多悲剧再继续，我们才能知道高志胜到底在哪里，张海涛到底遭受了哪些的酷刑。所以希望大家能够和我们一起去追寻真相，早日结束中共的暴政。谢谢大家。
So, I will encourage everyone here to hunt for the truth, and because that is the way to end the CCP's atrocities, so that we could know where is Mr. Gao Zhisheng and where is Mr. Zhang Haitao. And I encourage people to stand up, to get to know the truth. Thank you, everyone.
My name is Bob Fu. I'm the founder and president of China Aid, a non-profit international NGO dedicated for religious freedom for all and rule of law in China. I was born and raised in China. My mother was a survivor of Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward, under which from 1958 to 62, at least 20 million Chinese people died. I want to thank the Berkeley College Republican for the courage to host tonight's event. Thanks for the leadership, Amanda and David, against all the odds. This topic about the atrocities of the CCP is very timely. It is not and should not be a partisan topic, not a right or left topic, because it involves the humanity. For those who are still doubting about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and the reality of the atrocities, just after hearing the testimonies, the stories of Ms. Geng He, Ms. Aijie, and Mr. Fang Zheng, how can we deny that? As James just elaborated, at least 80 million people were killed, murdered, died out of unnatural death in the past 70 years under the CCP's brutal rule. That's more than what Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler has killed, even combined together. I just came back from, flew from Washington, D.C. yesterday after hosting with the Victims of Communism Foundation a press conference welcoming our newly rescued, the first Kyrgyz ethnic Christian family from Xinjiang, Mr. Ovabek Tudakwen, his family. On Wednesday, nearby the White House, Mr. Ovabek, who is a trained lawyer, shared his story about what happened to him. For 10 months, he was put in one concentration camp in 2018. Put in the tiger chair, being fed with unknown pills, forced injection of unknown liquid into his body. He eyewitnessed in that one cell of the concentration camp, 34 people, most of them, of course, ethnic Uyghurs. Some are Kyrgyz, some are Kazakh ethnicities. They were treated like that. In order to even go out of that one prison cell of that concentration camp to the yard, he has to go through 13 different doors, all with military like guns, some with, he's observed, with gasoline gun. And sometimes they were put in a small, tiny cell, only can hold one person. No window at all. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Communist Party and Xi Jinping himself has committed genocide according to the Pentagon's estimate, between 1 to 3 million people, primarily in Xinjiang, had been put into over 380 concentration camps in today's China, in Xinjiang. Let's see the picture, next picture. So in churches, in temples, in mosques, this is in today's China. You have those who are allowed to exist, they have to put a Chairman Mao's photo and Chairman Xi Jinping's photo on both sides of a little cross on the stage, on the sanctuary of the church, in a mosque, in a Tibetan Buddhist temple. This is called Sinicization. 中国化，叫宗教中国化。Sinicization of religion, which means any religion, any faith who is found not compatible with the socialism, with the communism ideology, has to be treated like this way, has to be destroyed. Thousands of Chinese, the crosses has become enemy of the state, being ordered to be taken down, or being forcefully demolished or burned. And in the past few years, under this slogan of Sinicization, 中国化, millions of Chinese children, Christian children, were forced to renounce their faith by signing a Communist Party prepared form in front of the public. Otherwise, their teachers will be punished. Their parents, grandparents would lose their social welfare. So today is Good Friday. Good Friday. So we know what Jesus Christ has done. It is the suffering. It is, of course, the crucifixion. And now, really, literally, all the independent faith and the Chinese faithful are suffering this kind of brutality, atrocity. Last February, China 8, we rescued a family from Xinjiang. That's our first rescue from the family from the concentration camp. This young Kazakh Muslim lady, Gorrie, she spent nearly 2 years in several concentration camps. She shared with us not only herself was brutally raped in the concentration camp, but she was forced by the concentration guards to handcuff, and then these young, beautiful ladies in the concentration camp in a dark room, lock them down on a bed, and then she was forced to go out, and then men were being arranged, walk into this room, and when she heard this man was shouting to the crying, screaming ladies, said, "We paid for this," in Mandarin Chinese, she realized this is the government orchestrated systematic prostitution against these young women in the concentration camps. And she herself was suffered so much after we rescued her to West Texas, or Midland, Texas. That's where our headquarters is. Almost, I couldn't remember how many nights and days, even midnight, we got the phone call. My staff got phone call. I got phone call to where she was sleeping with her 5-year-old daughter and her husband. I saw with my own eyes, she was scrambled under her bed, said she was painful, she was full of pain. We sent her to the ER multiple times, could not detect where the pain is. She just, basically being fed and injected with too much of this unknown medication. She could not find out. If you don't call it atrocity, if you don't call genocide, then what it is? And when the Communist Party would be held accountable? The next slides. I just want to share 2 quick stories. This Pastor Wang Yi and his wife, he was a trained lawyer. In 2005, he and other 14 Chinese human rights defenders were named as the Person of the Year by the Asians Newsweek. And then he became an underground church pastor called Early Rain Covenant Church. Just because he preached a sermon based on John 3:16, said God so loved the world. And then he called for President Xi to repent and give him the opportunity of salvation. And then he was arrested and sentenced to 9 years and being accused of as the instigation of the subversion of state power. His wife was arrested. So, at least 200 of members of his church. Among them, at least 80 of the women were being abused, were being tortured, including his wife, Miss Zhang Haitao. Next one, Pastor Zhang Haitao, a Chinese-American pastor, a close friend of mine, who could live a good life with his American dream. He came to the U.S. 30-some plus years ago and married with a Caucasian American wife, Jimmy Powell from North Carolina, pastoring a big Chinese church in the Triangle area in Raleigh-Durham. But he could not give up his mission dream to take care of both the poor, the needy, and the vulnerable in China. So he made a contract with his church, said, I need to spend at least half a year in China to help spread the gospel, to help the Chinese people. And then, a few years ago, he set up 16 schools for 2,000 children by mobilizing the American church, Chinese church, in the Burma-China border areas for this persecuted group called Kachin group. The Burmese military had committed genocide against that ethnic minority group. So when he saw that, he just wanted to help these 2,000 children by setting up 16 schools. And then Communist Party lured him back to China on the border area and sentenced him 7 years imprisonment. 7 years imprisonment. Ladies and gentlemen, as the former U.S. ambassador, Senator Sam Brownback, called it, Xi Jinping has launched a war against faith, all independent faith, Christian faith, Catholic faith, Falun Gong faith, Tibetan Buddhist faith. Any faith has a spirit of independence. He declared war. Good luck. A war against God. He's not the first one tried. We have seen the pharaohs in Egypt not only tried once, 10 times, right? We have seen Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian powerful king, maybe more powerful with more wealth than Communist Party has. What had happened to them? The Pharaoh's army were buried, right, under the sea, Red Sea. The Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, became an animal, ate grass. And what had happened to his predecessors, Chairman Mao, who had tried to? Before the Cultural Revolution, Chairman Mao basically, and his wife, Madam Jiang Qing, after burning hundreds of thousands of copies of Bibles at the Shanghai Public Revolutionary Square in 1967, she declared, she said, from today's on, Christianity will forever belong to the History Museum of China. And guess what? 10 years later, she was arrested. Another 10 years, I think, she hanged herself in her prison. But in 1976 or 1980, barely 10 years after the Cultural Revolution, when Chairman Mao declared an atheist state, the number of Chinese Christians tripled from 3 million Christians in 1966, when Cultural Revolution was announced, to 9 million Christians. I think Xi Jinping has not read, maybe he's not even illiterate, educated, any history lesson. This is what Pastor Zhang Haitao wrote from his prison. We smuggled out some poems. This is what Pastor Zhang Haitao wrote. He said, "You can take away my freedom, but you can't take my prayers. My prayers have wings and leaps over the iron mesh high wall. Many brothers and sisters have heard them, and they fly freely every day and reach the heaven on the blue sky. You can impose heavy punishment on me, but you can't hold my soul and spirit. It is like a joyful yellow bird, gently prays to the iron gate. My Savior must have heard my voice." At this Good Friday, Easter weekend, may the Spirit of Christ, His resurrection, continue to encourage not only those who are still suffering the atrocity, like Gao Zhisheng, like Zhang Haitao, like millions others, prisoner of conscience, but those of us in the free world, take courage, be a voice for those voiceless. So once again, I thank the Berkeley, this brave Berkeley College Republican Students Association for giving us opportunity to speak up. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Minghui. I'm an undergraduate student here at Cal, just like many of you sitting here today. I would like to share my family's story with you all as a survivor of communism. My parents and I practice Falun Dafa, also called Falun Gong, a peaceful spiritual belief that focuses on the improvement of mind and body. Our master, the founder of Falun Dafa, teaches us to use the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance to guide our everyday lives. Through reading the Falun Dafa books, I learned to treat others with kindness, even when it's not reciprocated. I learned to see conflicts as opportunities to improve myself, even if I don't seem to be at fault. And I also learned to be more empathetic and to always consider situations from someone else's perspective. And there are so many other wonderful things I learned from the practice. But when I was in China, I did not dare to tell anyone about this. Ever since July 1999, the year before I was born, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, had issued an order to eradicate Falun Gong. It destroyed books and materials, used all of its state media as propaganda machines to slander Falun Gong. And it persecuted the innocent practitioners who simply wanted to adhere to the faith that they had benefited from tremendously. But that was not allowed. Over the past 23 years, several millions were imprisoned, and the amount of which many were tortured or even killed. In 2006, the world was shocked to learn that many Falun Gong practitioners were killed on demand for their organs. I wish I had seen what China was like before the persecution began. My parents told me every morning the city parks were filled with Falun Gong exercise sites of varying sizes. People would show up to do the gentle exercises and meditation, clean up the area afterwards, and head to work. My parents told me they met some of their closest friends there. They were of different occupations and different ages, many of whom I would later meet. And they were among the kindest, bravest, and most selfless people I know. But as soon as the crackdown started, life had turned upside down. Unable to sit still through the overwhelming news about the people around them getting imprisoned for their faith, my parents brought train tickets to Beijing, hoping to appeal to the officials and tell them about the truth. But they were arrested before they even reached the appeals office. My mom was 8 months pregnant with me at the time, so she was released after a few days, but my father was illegally detained for way longer. After I was born, my parents had to go into exile to a small city in southern China where the local authorities did not know there were Falun Gong practitioners. But that was not a long-term solution after all. As an absolute last resort, they left me with my grandparents in my dad's hometown in central China shortly after I turned 1, so I could at least temporarily have a stable life. My father came to pick me up when I was 5. I did not know who he was, and I did not want to leave with him. We returned to Guangzhou, where my mother was illegally imprisoned in a brainwashing camp, or so-called re-education center. As far back as my memory goes, that was the first time I've seen my mother. She was cuffed to a chair with a very thick plastic tube inserted into her nose. And several people were right next to her guarding her. She was in the process of being force-fed liquids that had an unbearable smell. She was clearly in excruciating pain and was terrified. I remember crying and not wanting to approach her. I knew I have a mother, but I could not believe this was the person I've dreamed so many times about. What is happening to her? Many years later, I learned that she had just gone on a hunger strike for more than 40 days. So the officials in the center decided to force-feed her as a way to keep her alive while putting her in even more pain. In fact, she told me many years later that every force-feeding felt like a near-death experience. I realized many years later that the CCP had purposely shown my mother suffering in front of me as an attempt to psychologically wreck her will. I forgot how long it took until my mother was released, but I remember that my family barely enjoyed much time together. Because not long after we united, my father was kidnapped by the CCP in 2007, when I was only 7 years old. My mother and I went on many multi-hour-long bus rides trying to reach different official departments, asking them where exactly my father was taken to. They always dodged a question and pushed us to another department. When we finally found out where my father was, we demanded to visit him, but they told us it's not possible unless he gives up the practice. How ridiculous is that? What is the legal basis in that? In fact, the CCP has absolutely no legal basis in persecuting Falun Gong. All of the arrests, torturing, and murdering were done illegally, even according to its own laws. Since I could not see my father, I started writing to him. Because all our letters were monitored, we could not talk about sensitive topics. So I would tell him about just getting very good grades in school, attending swimming lessons and gaining a huge tan, learning Chinese calligraphy but ended up staining my shirt with ink, and just sharing with him the small details of our life. Though he was living and fighting in the darkness, his letters were filled with so much light. It was the most thoughtful, encouraging advice and the most humorous phrases. They always brighten up my days. One year, just before my birthday, he wrote a tongue twister poem to me as a present. And that is the tongue twister he wrote. He put in so much thought and love into every letter he writes. Perhaps that was the only way he could fulfill his role as a father. Many years later, when I reread those letters, I realized he never talked about his sufferings with me. He always sounded so uplifting and told us not to worry about him. He apologized in multiple of his letters for not writing back to me soon enough. He apologized in multiple of his letters for not writing back to me soon enough because it's quite inconvenient. I did not think too much of it back then, but when I grew older and learned what had happened to him, my heart breaks every time I think about what those inconveniences could have been. Was it the daily 16 consecutive hours of forced labor? Was it day after day of being tied up to a chair without being allowed to move? Or was it... I cannot bear to think too much into it. He was released after a year and a half inside the forced labor camp. But not even 2 years later, he was kidnapped once again to a brainwashing camp, where his blood pressure shot up to the 200s and was extremely weak. The center officials did not want to bear the responsibility of yet another human life, so he was temporarily released to be medicated. And that's when we made the difficult decision of leaving everything behind and fled to Thailand to seek asylum from the United Nations. In 2013, we came to the United States. I feel incredibly fortunate and thankful to be together with my parents here, where I can tell you all about our experiences without worrying that I could be jailed. We're just an ordinary family. We just wanted a place where we could freely practice Falun Gong and freely believe in the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. And yet we had to risk everything to make that come true. At least 20 million individuals in China share the same wish, but it has not yet come true for them. Many of them are, at this very moment that I'm speaking to you, being persecuted inside those dark cells. I cannot help but wonder, if the Chinese Communist Party is as strong as it claims to be, why is it so afraid of a group of people who just want to become better individuals and to benefit the society? And it's definitely not just the Falun Gong practitioners who are subjects to this brutal persecution. Sitting with us today, Ms. Geng and Ms. Li Aijie, both of their husbands, Mr. Gao Zhisheng and Mr. Zhang Haitao, respectively, are still inside mainland China. People like them are warriors who endanger their own lives to speak for the persecuted people. They knew what could happen to them, and yet they fearlessly proceeded. I would like to hereby pass on my deepest respect and my most sincere gratitude to them. For all of us here in this free world, the least we can do is to tell more people about what you learned tonight and stand up firmly against the atrocities of the CCP. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, thank you all for your speech tonight. I do appreciate it, and we are all glad to hear. It's very painful to hear all these stories coming from China and hearing about people that are persecuted every day in these education camps. My question is for Mr. Fu. So I recently read an article about Vera Zhao. She was a student at University of Washington, and you were very instrumental in helping her get out of China when she was trapped there with her family. So I just wanted to see if you can maybe elaborate on there and tell us more about how you were able to get her out together with the State Department and Secretary Mike Pompeo as well during the Trump administration. So.
Thank you very much for that question. Where's Joe? She was a junior student at University of Washington when she traveled to China, back to her hometown in Xinjiang. That's I think about 3 years ago. She just actually had a major cancer surgery. But she wanted to visit her biological father. Her mother brought her to the United States when she was very young, about 8 years old. So she was pretty much educated here. Her mother married with she's an American citizen, naturalized citizen, and her stepfather is a Dutch American. But after she went back to Urumqi, she just because she tried to submit her homework through a VPN in a hotel in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang. She was kidnapped, surrounded at midnight by the military police, put a black hold, and took her to a concentration camp. So her mother, of course, the first thing her mother did was to go to the University of Washington to appeal for intervention, for the school at least to speak up. And instead, the university, this is a direct quote. I heard, not myself heard, but I heard directly from a U.S. State Department official in the room when I brought her mother to the State Department to ask for urgent intervention. And the State Department, actually that official called the university president office and asked for the university to use this connection with China to intervene. What had happened? The university, a high-level official, I won't name, said, sorry, we can't do anything because we have a $2 million project negotiating with China now. I was wondering what kind of project. Later on, some journalists found during that time there was a Huawei, the Chinese spying kind of company in the US, the cell phone company, kind of a donation project to University of Washington. And so I kind of made a further effort and introduced her mother to Mr. Matthew Pottinger. At that time, Mr. Pottinger was the deputy, was the senior director for the President Trump's National Security Council in the White House. So it was really through some very high-level intervention and pressure, and China finally, after 1 year, actually 1 year after Vera was released from the concentration camp, she was still not allowed to come back to the U.S. She said one day she even had covered her hair and most of her face, tried to walk across the road in her father's neighborhood. Immediately after she crossed the road at Urumqi, I think it's not even Urumqi, another small city, police just grabbed her shoulder and took her and said, have you committed a crime? The face recognition camera just picked you up from that red light. So we're glad at least she was able to be back. The appeasement has become accomplice. I think University of Washington is just one of the institutions. And how many have been accepting the CCP's cash, money, Confucius Institute, and inviting the CCP spies coming into our university campus to brainwash. I think we can all find them. I mean, just like 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, the DOJ indicted 5 of them. I'm glad at least we're still looking for this. But thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello. First of all, thank you guys so much for being here. It's an honor to be in your presences and to just hear your guys' stories. I was very emotional. I can't believe that these things are happening to humans in the world and that people are so silent about this issue. I know even here at Berkeley, people have been tearing down our flyers and have been really hostile towards this event, which shocks me after hearing all of your personal accounts even more, and just makes my blood go cold. My question is for all the panelists. I don't know if somebody can maybe translate to some of the panelists who don't speak English, but what do for each panelist, what do each of you think would be the best way that we could support you here in the United States? And that could be like emotional, it could be spiritual, it could be putting on events like this, but hopefully a personal answer from each of you guys just so we know what we can do.
To me, I think it's pretty hard, very hard, because China is far away from the United States. And technically or practically, I would like to say, please say no to communism. You're helping yourself and you're helping us. Set the good model for the world. Please. That's what I want to say. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
我就你一会帮我翻译啊。我觉得他刚才问是他们能帮我们去更在美国做这些。其实我很希望在伯克利有更多的这种像今天这样子的活动，而且希望有更多的像你们这样子的大学生，不管是来自美国的还是在这边留学的学生，能够参加到这个活动来。但是今天我看到来的学生并不多，所以我有点失望。希望下次有类似的活动，能有更多的学生来。
I hope that you guys can throw more events like this. I hope that more university students, whether they're from the U.S. or international students, they can come to attend these events and learn more about communism. I'm seeing not that many students here, which I'm a little disappointed of, but hopefully next time there will be a greater student attendance here.
其实大家都知道，现在在美国的大学校园里，有一群这种来自中国的留学生，我们称他为小粉红。他们深受中共宣传的毒害，在美国的校园里，他们在尽量的维护中共的很多的事情，在客观的在帮中共做很多的宣传。其实美国大学的很多学生也面临这个很重要的这么一种挑战，要去跟这些小粉红们去斗争。
Actually, there are a lot of international Chinese students in many U.S. University campuses who are very supportive of the Chinese Communist Party. We call them the little pink 小粉红, and actually it is quite a challenge for many scholars here in the United States to kind of
需要他们做出很多的，就是你们这些学生在面对着你们这些同学当中，其实你们是有很大的挑战的。
So it's a great challenge sometimes to deal with them, but yeah.
因为我知道在很多校园中，比如说在对待6·4的问题，比如说在支持香港问题，包括支持法轮功问题上，很多中国大陆来的这些小粉红和美国的当地的学生，以及另外的一些学生，他们中间是有很大的分歧和冲突的，这个也是你们需要面临的挑战。
And I know when it comes to stances on the 1989 Tiananmen massacre in terms of Hong Kong issue, Falun Gong issue, you're going to face a lot of conflicts with these little pinks, and it's a great challenge for you guys.
对，其实我希望今年的6·4能够在伯克利，我们也有一个类似的这种纪念6·4的活动，希望有你们的学生的社团能帮我们组织，到时候我一定会来。
Actually, it's close to June 4th now, and we're hoping to have an event here to honor those to honor June 4th, and I really hope that you guys can throw an event, and I'll for sure be here.
On a practical side, you ask a great question. What can you do as a student at Berkeley? You know, a while back when I was in college, South Africa was a pariah nation for good reason. And there was all kinds of student movements to boycott and divest and bring about awareness and so forth. It's harder today for you because so much of academia has been penetrated by the CCP. Marxism itself is, I discussed earlier, it's been academicized, it's been sanitized, it's been theoretical, it's discussed in detached ways, it's given a level of validity that it certainly doesn't deserve. And the problem with that is that the 1,000 Talents program, the Confucius Institute, those are on your school, those are on your campus. We have some of the best politicians money can buy from China. Okay? So it is a challenge, and the mainstream media doesn't do anything about it, obviously. So I guess on an individual level, it's pushback. If you're in a class, you have facts. And too often there's kind of this equivocating of one regime or one type of government to another and so forth. But when you have facts, you can push back. Don't buy the narrative. I know the narrative is kind of a key word in today's world. Well, don't buy the narrative. Don't believe it. Push back and don't believe what you're being told when people try to sanitize the horrendous things that the CCP is doing to people. And it starts with one person, I suppose, right? I mean, you do what you can do.
Awesome. So I think we're going to move on to the next question. And let's keep the questions short because I think we're running out of time. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being all here today. It's an incredible honor to be in your presence and hear your stories. I oftentimes, when discussing with fellow students or friends or people who show sympathy towards the CCP, Marxism, socialism, communism here in the United States, can often talk about my family who fled from China or fled from Eastern Europe and fled from Russia and fled from the communists. But it's been very difficult many times talking to students on campus or in other campuses who are very sympathetic to the CCP, or talking to students who feel that the best thing they can do is just appease this government. They feel like there's no way out. They own student debt. They can do something to better themselves. How do we reach out and speak to people, and this is to anyone who can answer, how do we reach out and show some light, bring some truth, and convince people who may not even agree with communism at all, but it's the allure and the incentives the CCP offers people that they want and that they would like to receive? How do we show them the light? How do we inform them, show them another way?
One by comparison. I mean, look, the CCP is the Nazi regime of our time, writ large. So don't be afraid to use accurate, although shocking, comparisons. That's what they are. They're worse than the Nazis in some ways, obviously, on scale. But you have to, as I said before, you have to push back. You have to have the courage of your convictions and not be afraid to be shouted down or whatever it might be. And your professors will do that. They'll shut you down, but really it's about not believing the narrative of the mainstream media, not believing the narrative of mainstream education, and presenting it with facts. You shine the light. You shine that light and say, look, this is what's real. If this was 1938, we'd be protesting against the Nazis. Well, hey, we didn't know what they were doing. Well, now we know what the Chinese are doing, what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. And ask the question, why aren't you appalled? Why aren't you against it? So you go on the offensive, perhaps. Ask them, why aren't you doing these things? Why aren't you against these things? Because there's plenty to be against. So there's a lot of, the tide is working the other way, right? The tide is in media, academia, political affiliations. All of that's favoring the Chinese right now, the Chinese Communist Party. But the reality is you get these great folks up here, brave people who are voices. Well, you can magnify their voices, write about it, talk about it. It starts here at the university level. That's where it starts.
Yeah, one quick point is, there are two types of those who resist the truth, right? So you have to make a discernment first. The first type is they are either being sent directly by the Chinese state security or government with a political task just to carry out this transnational repression. The FBI actually just recently set up a special website to report, this is against the law. So these people should be held accountable by the law. And if those who are really open for information, I think we should start, as Jim said, from the stories, from true stories. These are not abstract numbers of like 20 million, 30 million, who died. These are happening right now. I mean, if you want, invite those like we rescued from Xinjiang, the survivors, Muslims, Christians alike. We can supply you to have them speak, with their own experience, what had happened, what they have observed, with objectivity. So I think that hopefully can swing, and the truth will set them free, right? They need truth. Absolutely. Yeah.
So I would also like to add on to that question. I think a lot of here in the West, they would think, oh, okay, CCP bad, that is a China problem, right? Why, okay, like maybe there's not that much we should criticize. It's like someone else's government. But actually, I think over the past 2 years, we have seen how the CCP's like suppression of free speech has like caused tremendous consequences here, even in the West. For example, maybe we all know the doctor who initially found out about COVID-19 started spreading in China, Dr. Li Wenliang, and he was shut up by the authorities. If the Chinese government had not put its initial attention to suppressing free speech, suppressing doctors who are coming from that background, maybe so many lives could have been saved. It's definitely not a China issue anymore. It's affecting everyone in the free world. Yeah, that's what I like to add. Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Good evening to all the speakers. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I'd like to show you a lot of honor for your bravery coming to speak with us today. My question today was directed at Mr. Fang Zheng, if you wouldn't mind translating for me. You were a student in Beijing during the Tiananmen massacre, and you were there and you were showing your own bravery at that time, and you believed in the movement for democracy, and that was decades ago. But what I was wondering today was, and I think what over 1,500 people right now who are watching online are wondering, is what circumstances need to arise in China to revitalize that movement towards democracy, and how can we in America help with that?
Do you mind asking the first part of your question again?
Yeah, how can, what circumstances need to arise in China to revitalize the movement towards democracy, and then how can we help with that?
谢谢大家提的这个问题，其实挺尖锐的，我也比较困难的回答。我离开中国已经13年了，但是我知道在中国每一天我们都有很多的人在推动、在从事这种促进中国民主的这种运动。但是你要说具体的在中国有一个什么样，我想你的意思是，中国是有个什么样的契机，或者是有个什么样的机会，能够使中国有这种民主转型？这个我很难说。但是现在有一个一个大家都在说的一个奇怪的问题，就是说习近平本人就是一个总加速师。那么习近平现在在中国国内做的这一切，让人看到非常荒唐、非常不可思议的这种事情。其实客观上在加速中共的灭亡，那使得中国的老百姓更多的在觉醒，因为他在不停地制造各种的灾难，而这每一个灾难都会唤醒更多的中国人来认清中共这个政权的这个不合法，使得这个政权会早日结束。
You asked a very sharp question. It's been 13 years since I left China. If you mean that, if you mean by what opportunity do we need to have like a democracy rise in China, actually me myself, as in Mr. Fang Zheng, has always been involved with many grassroots movements trying to fight for democracy in China. But actually right now we are seeing that the current president Xi Jinping, people call him an accelerator. He is an accelerator of the CCP's destruction. He's been doing a lot of, how should I say, I don't know how to translate, stupid things, which are sort of, in a way, waking people up to the CCP's atrocities. And yeah, people are getting to know CCP more.
对，就是说，习近平本人所做的这些，在中国的这种不可思议的事，比如说现在这种所谓的清零政策，各种各样的这种中国的这种倒退，这种回到文革的这么一种状态，使得中国老百姓更多的感觉到中国这个政权的荒诞，这个政权的这个腐朽，使得可能会加速中共的灭亡。
A lot of the policies launched by Xi Jinping, they're very ridiculous. For example, the what they're doing to the people in Shanghai right now, and then it's waking the people in China up, and people are seeing how ridiculous this regime is now.
但是说到 海外如何能帮助或者说能促进中共更早的这种和平的民主转型？其实大家知道，中共这个政权现在利用这种高科技的手段，对人进行这种精准的分割、精准的监控、精准的这种封杀，使得人们在国内形成一个有效的反抗非常的困难。那么这个是需要借助一些外部的一些高科技的力量去打破这种封锁。 那么，解除网络封锁其实是一个最重要的一个方式，我们觉得也是个可行的一个方式。比如说，马斯克的信念，也许以后在中国会对中国的这种民间的这种组织，能够形成一个这个突破中国的封锁，是一个很好的一种方式。也许这个是最后能促进中国民主转型的一个很好的手段。
As in what the people in the West can do.
就是说，在海外我们如何能够推动？因为中国现在利用高科技的这种网络的封锁，他们能对每个人进行很精准的控制和这种封锁。那么打破这种网络封锁。
Yeah. So currently in China, they're using the big data to launch a very severe surveillance system on its people, and then in that we will need help from the West in terms of the technology to, for example, break through the internet firewall.
Starlink. Yeah, you know Starlink.
Okay.
Yeah, so Elon Musk's Starlink is an example of the technology that could potentially help China proceed through help the grassroots democracy movements in China.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I have a question that's kind of been partially answered in different parts by other people, but I wanted to just kind of rephrase it. How would you think the U.S. government can best or should best tackle the Chinese Communist Party's suppression of, say, Uyghur minorities, the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, etc.?
I can help. Yeah, I can help. Sure. A lot of the policies of the prior administration, in terms of heavy tariffs, trade embargoes, linking behavior in Hong Kong to linkages with trade embargoes and tariffs and so forth, putting the pressure on. So it's China has a lot of vulnerabilities. They're an aging society. They're not reproducing themselves, and the reason is because nobody's really fond about their future prospects in China. Their savings rate is 37 to 45%, which means that people aren't spending money. They're not spending money because they're not very optimistic. So you have people with aging parents on both sides, getting married, not having kids. saving their money. At the same time, arable land, food supply chains are being disrupted. So the U.S. can do a lot. It was doing a lot. We can do that again. We can put a lot of pressure on China for their support of Russia in the invasion of Ukraine. We can link behavior to and de-link economically. And China is trying to counteract that, obviously, with purchasing farmland and here in America, factories and food processing plants and all kinds of agricultural areas in Latin America and other parts of Asia, Africa. So they're trying to kind of insulate themselves from that kind of economic retaliation, but they can certainly be retaliated against economically, technologically. The daughter of the Huawei owner was arrested in Canada and held for 2 years in house arrest. The prior administration dissuaded many nations from using Huawei spyware, which was a loss. It cost China billions and billions and billions of dollars. So it's really about deciding that you're going to punish China. Plenty of places to do it, plenty of ways to do it effectively. It's not a matter of can we, it's a matter of will we.
Could I ask a clarifying question? Would you draw a distinction between sanctions and tariffs?
Yeah, so that's exactly I want to mention. Is I think the one thing government can really do is to put effective sanction mechanisms. I think the Global Magnitsky Act, Human Rights Accountability Act. For the first time, really starting after the genocide, after the Hong Kong, putting individuals. Remember, those atrocities were committed by those brutal individual Communist Party officials. They should be held accountable, from Xi Jinping to the Politburo members. And it was under Trump administration, the first time to Politburo members. The first one is Chen Quanguo from the Xinjiang, the former Xinjiang party secretary, was put on the list. And how many Communist Party officials has their relatives here in Silicon Valley, in California? I mean, how much wealth they had already got here? I mean, President George W. Bush told me, I can reveal privately, even back to that time, the Bush 43 time, he said the CIA had made a specific investigation about all these people, the Communist Party, the Saudis, their wealth, the corrupted wealth, were being stored here. So if the U.S. government is serious, they can really do a lot of things to stop this. Because if you only decry the party or political system, they don't feel the pain. I mean, so to put tariffs, of course, that put a pain, but put this Communist Party their own pocket and their concubines. They're in Los Angeles. There's
That's a word we don't use very often, but
concubine village. They earnest when so they need to be sanctioned. I think there are a lot of things. I mean, this sanction mechanism certainly need to be there. Yeah.
你好，我很愿意回答这个问题。我是美国公民，我的身份的庇护呢是来源于我的先生。我的先生是在国内，他是律师，他用他的律师职业为受迫害人代理案子的时候，然后20年对我先生打压破坏，到现在都没有结束。今天是我先生强制失踪的第1706天。我认为美国政府、议员、康官司任何的政府应该在公开的场合提我先生的名字。美国大使馆的官员应该去找我的先生，因为我是美国的公民，我先生是公民的家属。谢谢你。
Miss Geng was trying to say she's an American citizen. She's an American citizen. So she feels American government, the United States government, has the duty, to obligation to solve the problem. At least in public, the government has the responsibility to declare publicly to China's government to release the family member of an American citizen. That's what she was trying to say. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your responses.
Okay, I think we're going to do one more question since we're running out of time. So.
You know, like Tiananmen massacre happened and the West just pours tons of money to China still. Like what should we do? To stop this? Or what's the strongest method for them to stop?
Strongest method is decoupling, economic decoupling from China.
Yeah, totally agree.
It has to happen. If it doesn't, there's no remedy, except for within China. And as I mentioned earlier, China spends more on domestic security than it does on its entire defense budget. So Xi Jinping has a big worry about Chinese people themselves. So we'll have to see. But yeah, economic decoupling is the answer. We were doing that. We're not doing that so much today.
Definitely under current presidency, right? Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for attending our event. Thank you for everyone in person. Thank you to approximately, I think it was 1,500 people online. For those of you who want to get involved with the Berkeley College Republicans, we have our weekly meetings on Wednesdays in Wheeler 104 from 8 to 9 p.m. It was a privilege hosting our incredible speakers today, and we're looking forward to massive, incredible speaker events in the future, next semester. So thank you everyone, and have a great night.